The process of this, last night was narrative, part of Daniel, chapters 1 and 2. Last lesson was narrative, chapters 3 and 4. This lesson is chapters 5 and 6, narrative again. So these are all the stories in Daniel. Then we're going to go to the prophecy for the last 2 hours today. It'll be much less verse by verse because the prophecies are all jumbled together. So I'm just going to try to untangle them for you for the prophecies. That's the end of today. That will be prophecies. And then tomorrow morning for Sunday school, we'll do Daniel chapter 9, which was Daniel's intercessory prayer. And then for the message, we'll talk about resurrection in the Old Testament from Daniel chapter 12, where resurrection is mentioned twice. So that's the plan. We're almost done with the stories. So if you turn to Daniel chapter 5, that's where we're going. Now, when God restored Nebuchadnezzar to sanity in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar praised God and he resumed the throne, but he died 1 year later. So his rule did not last long after his conversion. His son, named Evil Merodach, that was really his name, ruled for about a year until his brother-in-law assassinated him. The assassin lasted 4 years, and then he was assassinated. And then his son reigned a few months until he was assassinated. Another son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar named Nabonidus, who was a general, took over. Now Nabonidus was a very religious man, and in fact he hated war stuff and politics, and he hated the climate of Babylon. So he moved to Saudi Arabia to live in a resort town, and he left his son Belshazzar in charge of the empire. Now Belshazzar was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and Belshazzar is the main character of chapter 5. You can follow along. We'll go through verse by verse as I read and comment on Daniel chapter 5. Verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. So there's a 30 or 40 year gap between the end of Daniel chapter and the beginning of chapter 5. All those minor guys were assassinated. We can ignore all of them. The Bible ignores them because they were unimportant. But Belshazzar, Nabonidus, they used to be allies 50 miles north, the Babylonians believe. So the Babylonians are not yet surrounded, but they know the enemy is approaching. The enemy armies, these Persians, they wore tall felt hats, long tunics, and carried long-range bows. They were really good archers. Cyrus and Darius were leading this army, and they're getting ready to assault Babylon probably within a week. The date we know was October 11th, 539 BC. We know the exact day. Now, King Belshazzar is not worried about these enemies. He knows they're there, so he cannot hide hundreds of in the open plain. Belshazzar is confident in the nations of Babylon that were built by Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather. He thinks it's impossible to forcibly enter the city. He thinks the Medes and the Persians will have to surmount many vast obstacles and that they will fail to capture the city. Now there were several strong fortress cities to the south and west of Babylon. It might take the Persians years to get rid of them too. Persia only had 2 ways of attacking. One was to come up the main road into Babylon and through the gate. The way was to come through the walls. Now Nebuchadnezzar dug tunnels around Babylon to form a moat. I told you about the moat. The main road passed over covered bridges into the Ishtar Gate. Why were the bridges covered? Because there were holes in the top, and archers could shoot through the holes at the guys trying to cross the bridge. So going through the bridge is a death trap. You don't want to do that. If you get through the deadly tunnel and the bridge, you get to the Ishtar Gate. It is cedar covered in bronze, which means you can't burn it down. And on the top of it are towers to drop burning pitch and shoot more arrows at you. So this is a terrible way to try to breach the city. Now you might want to avoid the main gate to try to knock the walls down. Of course, they're in the way. Now the moat is 30 to 40 feet across. By swimming or in boats. The wall. So do you have 60-foot tall ladders to climb up the wall, even if you get across the moat? And once you cross this wall, there's another 60-foot wall. How do you get your ladder up and over, down the other side, and up the next wall? There's layers of walls. Nebuchadnezzar was a genius at building fortifications. So you can see why Belshazzar is confident that Cyrus cannot take the city. All he can do is try to besiege the city. Here's the problem. The Euphrates River runs in there. They've got farms. it's going to be hard to get rid of Babylon. So Belshazzar wants to show his nobles just how nervous he is about the impending invasion by throwing a big party. Don't worry about it, guys. We're fine. We've got crops stocked up. We've got years' worth of food. Persians. 1,000 wealthy Babylonians came to the party. They gathered in the main royal chamber. We've dug this up in archaeology. It's 160 feet long and 50 feet wide. So it's almost like a football field. King Belshazzar wore his best clothes. He wore an embroidered tunic held to his leather belt. He had 2 long daggers on his belt. The hips were shaped like lions' heads, and the blades come out of the lions' mouths. That's how they were made. He wore a tall cylindrical crown like Abraham Lincoln's stovepipe hat, layered with gems and engravings of winged horses. He walked on gold tissue. The king could never touch the ground. He would be defiled by the ground. He had the longest beard in the kingdom, and they killed anyone who had a longer beard. So if he was there to cause trouble, he would ignore it. His guards would take care of him. So here they are, king, not afraid of the invaders. So look at verse 2. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines could drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels out of the temple of the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron, wood and stone. So as the party goes on into the night, the wine starts getting everybody a little tipsy, including the king. His father was very unpopular because he was stealing idols from all over the empire. He was so religious. In fact, what may have started the war against the Persians was when Nabonidus, this religious guy, sent his army into Persia to steal all their gods. That's why they got ticked off. So this whole war was started by the guy stealing idols from Persia. But Belshazzar didn't care about other religions. All he cared about was Marduk and Baal, who had ziggurats in the city. And at this party, he decided that it would be fun to conquer this foreign Jewish god by drinking out of his holy temple objects at his orgy. Verse 5. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw part of the hand that wrote. So these guys are all starting to drink, and God is known. Now I can only think of 2 times in the Bible when we say that God used his fingers to write a message. The first time was back in the book of Exodus when God wrote the 10 Commandments, 2 tablets of stone for Moses and the people of Israel. It was done with the finger of God. But now God comes back for a second encore and writes a message on the wall for King Belshazzar and the Babylonian drunkards. Now the inner walls of the palace are plastered with lime to make them light-colored so that the torches bounce light around. Near the torch so that everyone, or the king at least, could see the fingers. And it says that God wrote 4 words on this wall for the king. And they were also plastered, just like the walls, you might say. Verse 6. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him. So the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. Well, Belshazzar is not afraid of the army outside. He's not worried about military force. He's not worried about assassins. He's got guards all around him. But nothing can stop a ghostly hand from writing on his wall. And this scares him. Drunken stupor. Verses 7 and 8. The king cried out loud, "Bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers." The king spoke to the wise men of Babylon. "Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation will and have a chain of gold around it. He will be the third in the kingdom." So all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing nor make known to the king its interpretation. So all the experts are confused. Between them, the Magi knew hundreds of languages and dialects, but they couldn't interpret God's message. Verses 9 through 12. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet hall. The queen spoke and said, "Live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him the chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. So the king is very upset. He's demanding to know what the floating hand is writing on the wall. The queen comes running in, hearing the commotion. Now this queen, this is not one of his wives. This is his grandmother. This is Nebuchadnezzar's wife, perhaps the one who had the gardens made. Anyway, this wife comes in to calm down her grandson. And from what it says, it seems he has been removed from his position as the head of the Magi. The king no longer knows who he is. So Daniel's been out of commission for a while. And the king says that this Daniel has great abilities and says she thinks he can interpret the writing because he used to interpret everything for Nebuchadnezzar, your father. When she calls him your father, it just means grandfather, your ancestor. Now verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who's one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" So the king brings in Daniel, and Daniel's been living in Babylon for 64 years. So he's probably 78 years old. The party has been going on all night. We can guess that it's early in the morning, like maybe 2 in the morning. The half-drunk king starts by putting Daniel in his place. "Are you one of those slaves my grandfather caught all those years ago?" He's real nice too, Daniel. Verses 14 through 16. "In you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me to read this writing and tell me its interpretation, but they could not give interpretation of the thing. I've heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known its interpretation, you will be clothed in purple, have a chain of gold around your neck, and be made third ruler in the kingdom." So maybe King Belshazzar decides, okay, I should stop calling him slave and start flattering him a little bit. So I've heard you can figure out things and explain enigmas. And I'll restore your old position. I'll make you the third ruler in the kingdom. Now why is he only going to be the third ruler? Because Daddy, Nabonidus, is down in Saudi Arabia. He's the boss. So Belshazzar's only number 2. So Daniel will be number 3 if he gets this right. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said to the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself." In other words, stuff it. "And give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." Now Daniel surprised me here. He was very polite 50 years ago to King Nebuchadnezzar. But here Daniel snaps at Belshazzar without any respect or compassion at all. Now we can imagine several reasons for this. He's about 80 years old. You might say he's now a crotchety old geezer. Or it could be because Daniel was just wakened in the middle of the night and dragged into the palace, and he sees 1,000 fools in an orgy drinking out of the holy temple chalices. That might make him angry too. So whatever reason, Daniel tells the king he can stuff the gifts in his ears. Verses 18 through 21. "O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom of majesty, glory, and honor. And because of the majesty he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. Whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. He was driven from the sons of men, his heart was made like beasts, and his dwelling was with wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses." So Daniel says that God appointed Nebuchadnezzar, God gave him this power. So he goes on, verses 22 to 24. "But you, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. You have lifted yourself up against the God of heaven. They have brought the temple vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines are drinking wine out of them. And you praise silver and gold, bronze and here or no. And the God who holds your breath in his hands and owns all your ways you have not glorified. Thus the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written." So Daniel tells Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar was a proud brat. and now you're a proud brat. And pride was the sin of the Tower of Babel. Pride is now the sin of the palace of Babylon. In Jeremiah chapter 50, God says, I am against you, O arrogant one, declares the Lord. And that was Babylon that God was talking to. One has to wonder whether the Babylonian destruction of the temple in 586 BC, whether that was just vengeance. We have to wonder whether this vengeance is just for them destroying the temple, or is it also for Belshazzar desecrating all the temple objects. Verses 25 through 28. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and ended it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So Daniel reads and interprets God's graffiti. The message was not indecipherable, it was well. 4 words could not be understood in their strange pattern. Most of the words are nouns of ancient coins. It's rather like saying this, dime, dime, quarter, penny. It's no wonder no one could recognize what it meant. And Daniel says, here's what it means. The Babylonians, you think you're worth a large amount of gold, but God weighed you and you turned out to be worthless fool's gold, no more than a penny. So you've been weighed in the scales and found without value, so God is giving away the kingdom to Persia today. So that's the message from Daniel and God. Verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he is the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Now, my guess would be that King Belshazzar would have much rather had Daniel killed for his nasty prophecy, but he had promised in front of 1,000 nobles, so he had to keep his promise. And verse 30, that very night Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain. Now, the book of Daniel does not tell us what happened, how Babylon was overthrown. So I'm going to detail it for you from the ancient scripts of Xenophon and Herodotus, who were both Greek historians. How did the Medes and the Persians get into the impregnable city in only one night? The kingdom fell one night. Because Cyrus the Persian was a genius, and because Belshazzar was an idiot. Belshazzar had enemies in his own palace. You see, he was so proud, he was angry at 2 of Babylon's greatest generals. He had one of their sons publicly murdered and the other one publicly castrated just to embarrass his best generals. So the generals decided that Cyrus might be a better boss than Belshazzar. So they made a deal with the Persians. That night party, the 2 generals ordered all the guards at the gates to go to the party and have a good time. And they opened the gates. So the Persians snuck in and killed the king and had the whole place taken over before the... So it was a one-night takeover because Cyrus was a genius and Belshazzar was a moron. Jeremiah had been dead for 40 years, but his words in chapter 51 were quite prophetic. If you looked at Jeremiah 51, verses 36 and 39, verse 36, God says, I will dry up her sea and make her springs dry. The generals opened the gates, not the big gates at the Ishtar gate. The Euphrates River ran through the city and through the moats. They had gates with bars to keep guys from getting in. King Cyrus, 10 miles the river temporarily, causing the river level to fall to just a trickle. The generals raised the iron gates out of the river, and his soldiers walked through the riverbed. That's how they got into the city. And so Jeremiah seemed to have did that when he said, I will make their springs dry. And then in verse 39, Jeremiah said, in their excitement I will prepare their feasts. I will make them drunk, so they will rejoice and sleep a perpetual sleep and never awake. So all of the generals and colonels who were supposed to be defending the city were drunk and out of consciousness when the enemy came in and killed them. So it seems like Jeremiah 51 prophesied this fall of Babylon 40 years earlier. Well, applications of Scripture could be numerous, but I'll just point out a couple. The mighty empire of Babylon ruled the world for about 70 years. That's about the average lifespan of a human being in our time. Nations are subject to God's rule. No matter how impregnable your fortress may be, God can find a way to destroy nations when they also that Jehovah did not give Belshazzar multiple warnings. He had, 3 hours before he was executed. So he didn't get lots of chances. And the date that Babylon fell was October 12th, 539 BC. As with a nation, so with an individual. A man will not turn to God, no matter how clearly God shows himself, unless the Holy Spirit changes his heart. Belshazzar saw the hand of God write a warning on the palace wall, and he didn't believe it. He was dead in his trespasses and sins. He couldn't believe it unless the Holy Spirit changed his heart. God sent him an interpreter to explain it. He still didn't believe it. This is like the parable in Luke chapter 16 of the rich man and Lazarus. In Jesus' parable, a man in hell begs Abraham, send a ghost to earth to warn my relatives about hell so that they won't come here. Surely they'll believe a ghost. And Abraham replied, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. Ghosts and floating hands cannot convince an unsaved person. He's dead in his trespasses and sins. Psalm 139:16 says, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Your life will not be as long as short as you want it to be. You live longer than why? Because God has plans for your continued existence. Or you might die today. Why? Because God glorify God in your life, God will glorify himself on your life. There's a difference. You can glorify him willingly, or he will glorify himself by crushing you. Those are the two options that God offers. What point was there in leaving Belshazzar alive any longer? God says, we've weighed you in the balances, you're worthless. Your time is here. God is going to weigh all of us in the scales, and only those of us who have Jesus' righteousness will be found worthy. So now we'll move on to chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. These guys were mentioned in chapter 5. Who is Darius and where is Cyrus? Now Darius was probably King Cyrus's uncle. The Medes were his greatest ally. Cyrus had enemies to defeat. Babylon was only the first, and so he left his trusted friend, his uncle-in-law Darius, in charge of the city. You don't want to put anyone you don't trust in charge of Babylon, because I already told you how great the fortifications are. So you need to be sure you trust him. So let's look at Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Okay, so this system of authority is like the military. Cyrus is the boss. Darius runs Babylon. Colonels, and they've got 120 majors under them. The big question is, why did the Persians choose Daniel? Well, my guess is that Cyrus had spies in Babylon, including those 2 traitorous generals at the party. Surely they heard that during the invasion, Daniel told to his face that he was going to die that night. That must have impressed them. He was not in on their councils. He didn't know. So God must be with him. Maybe this Daniel is a sympathizer. Maybe he's a Persian sympathizer. He didn't like the Babylonian. Okay, so verse 3. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Like any godly worker, Daniel was the best worker in Babylon. He didn't cheat, steal, take bribes, govern rashly, or act lazy. So Darius wants to fire the other 2 administrators and leave Daniel alone at the top. Well, this doesn't sit well with the other 2 guys. Daniel was a Jew and not a Babylonian. Verses 4 and 5 say that the other guys launched ethics probes to try to find evil in Daniel. They hired private investigators to look for the dirt on Daniel, and they could find nothing. So they hatched a plot to get rid of Daniel based on his religion. Verses 6 and 7. So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, O King Darius, live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or man for the next 30 days, except to you, O king, should be thrown into the lion's den. Okay, first they flatter the king, and then they lie to him. They claim that all the leaders agree, though Daniel surely did not. They pretend that out of loyalty to the city, for 1 month only, Darius should call himself a god. You see, it's a Babylonian tradition to worship the king, and it helped you root out any disloyal types, if there were any around. So they're basically saying to Darius, you know, king, you're new here. Nobody knows you. You want to make sure they're loyal so there aren't any secret assassins. So we should worship you for a god, and if anyone refuses to worship you, we should execute them. They might be disloyal. And thinks, well, okay, I guess if this is the tradition in Babylon, maybe I should go along with it. Verse 9. Now, O king, issue this decree and put it in writing, so it cannot be altered, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which can never be repealed. So King Darius put this decree in writing. They know that a law, in order to be enforced and not changed, it needs to be written down. So get him to write it down, this to get rid of Daniel. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went around him praying and asking for God's help. So Daniel, as an administrator, he has a house in Babylon. It's at least 2 stories tall. And on the top floor, a window faces west toward Jerusalem. See, they didn't have glass windows back then. They only had shutters that they'd close to keep the sun out or the sand from blowing in. So Daniel was not intentionally flaunting the new law. It's just that he didn't shut the window. Think about it, over 70 years, Daniel praying 3 times a day, that would be more than 80,000 prayers if he just prayed 3 times a day. It's a lot of prayers. And verses 13 and 14. So they said to the king, Daniel, who's one of the exiles of Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel, and he made every effort until sundown. Did Darius realize he'd been played by the flatterers? They pretended worship to him, but it was only a ruse to kill off the only guy he liked in the city. So Darius tried to save him, but it couldn't be done. It was written and published, and he had to enforce it. In verse 15, the flatterers remind him that the day is almost over and he has to do his law. So verses 16 and 17. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. Then the king said to Daniel, May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of the nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. If you go to the next slide now, I think this is slide 7 or 8, you'll see some artistic representations of the lion's den. These are some of the better ones. Most of them are pretty bad and silly. Now Darius was probably a Zoroastrian. This was the growing religion in Persia where Darius and Cyrus came from. It was a monotheistic religion, sort of. They believed in one main god called Ahura Mazda, but they also have an equally powerful evil god. But anyway, since Judaism was also monotheistic, maybe Darius thought that this is the same God with a different name. Maybe my God, Ahura Mazda, is your God, Jehovah. I hope he'll save you. Now the Babylonians and Persians, you've already seen some of the ways they execute criminals and traitors. Here's the normal ones, though. They stabbed people, they hung them, or they impaled them. Those are the easiest ones. For major public demonstrations, they did burning, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But if you wanted to kill a public official for a smaller offense, you used the lion's den. Other officials could watch, but you didn't have a public crowd watching. You wanted the officials to learn their lesson and shape up and be loyal. Now, in the city of Babylon, archaeologically, we've discovered probably what was the lion's den. It's in the palace itself, right near the throne room, so that the king could order someone thrown in the lion's den and see it done. It was basically a manhole cover in the floor, and all they did was use sticks to pull the manhole cover off, and 15 feet down are the lions in a dark hole. The reason it's 15 feet is because lions can jump 11 feet. You don't want them jumping out into the palace room, the throne room. So the king can watch as you drop people into the lion's den, and you can hear them as they're crunching on the bones as they fall down. Well, after dropping the victims down the hole, you slide the lid back on the top and seal it around the edges with your rings, with wax. You pour hot wax into the edges and stamp it with your rings. That way the next day if you come and you see that the thing has been broken, you know the guards tried to get somebody out and you can execute them too. Well, no one ever escaped from the lion's den though. The lions were purposely underfed and kept starving. They mostly ate criminals, and so they're used to eating meat from people, even though people don't taste good, according to most wild lions. That's why they don't eat many of us. Usually when the stone opened, the lions see this as ringing the dinner bell. There's light coming in, food. They all come charging and wait under the light, so the guys don't even hit the ground before the lions are eating them. Now Daniel is 85 years old, and he's not very spry. He probably would have broken his legs and died just from the fall. But God was protecting him. Now these pictures, these are some of the better ones, believe it or not, but I want to show you a couple of problems with them. The problems in most of the paintings and Sunday school pictures you see about Daniel in the lion's den, they're almost all wrong because they all have African lions. You see these lions with big manes? There's a couple of problems with this. Not only are they African lions, they're all males. Only one male can live in a group. They kill each other. The most you could have is one male and all females for the rest. You can't have lots of males like they've got in here. It won't work. Also, these are African lions. Iraq is not Africa. Iraq is Asia. They have Asian lions. They look like mountain lions. They don't have manes. So a couple of mistakes. Also, I was shocked to see that almost all the Sunday school pictures show a young boy, like Daniel the boy thrown in the lion's den. He's 85 years old. He's not 10. So anyway, all the pictures are wrong. Just ignore them. Well, they kept 20 or 30 lions in the den, probably all females. Another silliness about the paintings, see the light streaming through on this one? That's not the manhole cover. You know, that looks like how are you going to fit a cap on that and put your wax rings? This was a purpose-built den for the lion. The other problem with a lot of pictures is the torches. How many of them have torches lit so that you can see the lions? Who goes down and changes the torches? That's what I want to know. You know, so all kinds of silliness. I worked at the Pittsburgh Zoo for 1 year as a tour guide, and I got a special tour of the lion's cage. There were several of us waiting in line, and when he opened the door, I rushed through, not thinking that he was still talking outside. There was a male lion at the length feet away. So I came in and tried to look because it was dark, and I'm like, oh, is there a lion in there? And his eyes open, and then his lip curled up, and I could see his teeth as he snarled. And then he 15 feet across with his paws out. Right in front of me, I fell backwards, screamed as he hit the cage. Fortunately, it didn't collapse. And I heard the zookeeper run in, and he saw me on the floor, and he says, oh, he does that to everybody. So that's the way lions are. They don't like people entering their domain. So anyway, Daniel would have been terrified. God had to protect him falling through the hole. They sealed up above him. The lions did not eat him. Now, why didn't they eat him? We'll see why in a moment. So verses 18 through 20. The king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Well, first of all, it's amazing that King Darius is so concerned about Daniel. He couldn't even sleep. Also, where did Darius get this kind of faith? I mean, Darius actually has some hope that Daniel might be alive in the lion's den. I can imagine the guards who are standing there. They've seen hundreds of people dropped into the pit, and they're probably saying to themselves, are you kidding? Alive? I mean, this lion's den, it's like a roach motel. Roaches check in and they don't check out. The lions would have eaten his flesh and crushed his bones by now. But here's the king yelling through the cracks, asking if Daniel is still alive. Verses 21 to 23. Daniel answered, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I done any wrong to you, O king. The king was overjoyed, and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wounds were found on him, because he trusted in his God. Now you can imagine that Daniel might have been rather angry at Darius for this whole lion's den experience. Even though Darius didn't intend to hurt him, he was rather stupid in falling for that plot. So even if Darius was not evil, he was a dummy. But Daniel is nice to Darius. Daniel also tells Darius that God sent an angel who shut the mouths of the lions. Now lions, although they are very aggressive, they are not stupid. Apparently they saw this angel and they decided it was better to go hungry than to go near the angel. So the angel must have been there even as Daniel fell into the pit to drive the lions back. Now there must have been a lot of confusion at the palace that morning. No one had ever come out of the pit before, so there's no system on how do we get him out. Nobody ever came out. So they probably had to get some ropes or cloths and lower them to Daniel and pull him up. The flatterers are probably at their houses sleeping in, feeling great that they got rid of the rival. And now verse 24. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Now you might wonder about this killing of all of Daniel's accusers. Back in those days, if you accused a man and he was sentenced to death, but the man somehow miraculously survived, the assumption of the judges was the victim is set free and the accusers were killed in his place. You kind of wish for that system of justice nowadays. When someone is falsely accused, you wish there would be some justice for them too. See, the miracle was viewed as proof that the gods believed the man was innocent, or the woman, and therefore the accusers must be evil. So even though Daniel was caught in the act of praying to a god other than Darius, the miracle proved that the gods supported him, and so all of his accusers have to die in his place. And the lions ate them immediately. In case some of the guards or the bystanders were thinking that maybe the lions got sick or were dead, evaporated when these guys didn't even hit the floor before they were eaten. Now in verses 25 through 27, Darius fixes his foolish law. Now in the law of the Persians and the Medes, you can't rescind a law, but you can modify it after it has been applied. So he modified the law saying that the people of the kingdom must worship the God of Daniel. So in other words, this whole month period where you're supposed to only worship me, you can also worship the God of Daniel if you want to. That's how he fixed the law. And verse 28, so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and under the reign of Cyrus the Persian. In short, Daniel lived happily ever after. We'll talk about that a lot more tomorrow in the sermon about resurrection of the dead. Now Darius, he had his ups and his downs. He allowed people to stroke his pride, and thus he fell into their schemes. So he lacked wisdom. However, he clearly cared about Daniel and tried to save him. Darius also has a lot of faith, more than a lot of us might have had. Darius reminds me a little bit of Pontius Pilate. He wants justice and tries to help an innocent man, but unlike Pilate, Darius actually cared about the victim. The accusers, they're all bad. In a literal sense, their crimes are like a scripture from Psalm 5, verses 15 and 16. Here's the verses, Psalm 5, 15 and 16. He who digs a hole and scoops it out falls into the pit he has made. The trouble he causes recoils on himself. His violence is down on his own head. So these guys set up an innocent man and in the same pit. From this text, which is that God will always protect. In fact, sometimes do not automatically become passive Christians. As I discovered at the Pittsburgh Zoo, he would have eaten me if there hadn't been a fence there. In ancient Rome, in the Roman Colosseum, lions killed thousands of Christians. So the application of the text is not that God will save you when you get tossed into a lion's den. God is capable of protecting us from all dangers, but does not always do so. Why? Because God always acts for his own glory. When God saved Daniel, it was to show his power to Darius and the Persians. When God left Christians to die in Rome by lions, God got glory by their courage in the face of death. Now, did you notice what Darius learned and wrote in his modified law? Here's what he wrote. He is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. Over and over in the book of Daniel, in Nebuchadnezzar, in Belshazzar, in Darius, God says the same thing, and all of these kings learn the same thing, which is God rules over all. God controls people's health. God gives them dreams. God reveals the dreams. God saves them from fiery furnaces. God turns them into cows. God restores them. God writes his hand on the wall. God kills them. God throws them into pits of lions. God saves them. All of this to show that God is in charge of everything. God is sovereign. Now, there are a lot of modern church denominations that do not believe in the sovereignty. They say that it is the free will of man. God can't make me do anything. It is specious and silly. Sovereign does not force you to do. So intricate and overarching, we don't have the slightest clue what God is up to most of the time. The Bible reveals to us the general will of God, what God would like us to do. In some parts of the Bible, prophecy, God sometimes reveals what he'll do in the future. But even then, God does not usually tell us how he will do it or exactly when he will do it. Do you understand that God does not owe explanation of his plans? This is where God becomes angry at Job, speaking to Job out of the whirlwind. God says to Job, "Who do you think you are? You don't know anything about what I'm doing, Job." Daniel seems to have been a rather patient person most of the time. He had to be, to put up with wackos like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and plotting co-workers. But more than that, how about Daniel's patience with God? Now that sounds kind of blasphemous. The idea that we might need to be patient with God, it sounds wrong because we always think of patience being for tolerating evildoers or bratty kids or nagging spouses. That's a different kind of patience. Patience in accepting your lot in life, being content. God is the one delivering us into hardships and blessings both. When God drops you into the frying pan, it's natural to be angry and confused. You ask, why is God doing this to me? But why is it a question? Why? A question of rebellion. You ask why because you don't like it, and you think you are owed an explanation. God is an impertinent and rebellious question. Instead of why, who? You need to understand that also. Stop asking why and start asking who. We are not. God is sovereign. We are the servants. We have to accept it. That's what Daniel teaches. So we can take some questions now. We've got a good amount of time. So the writing on the wall or Daniel in the lion's den? Are there any questions?
I think the lion's den was a pretty nasty place.
Yes, if you think about it, no one goes down to clean up. Poop and pee everywhere and dead men's bones everywhere. Yes, it would stink to high heaven. That's another problem with all the pictures you see, the paintings. He's standing on this nice cement floor. It's nice and flat. Okay. Other questions?
Why was Belshazzar so terrified by the handwriting? I mean, because he didn't acknowledge it.
Well, it doesn't say he was terrified by the handwriting. It says he was terrified because he saw the hand. So I guess seeing a disembodied hand, he saw it right. He doesn't seem to have been afraid of the words. He was interested in finding out what the words meant, of course. But he was terrified by what is this hand and why is it writing on my wall? So it would be like seeing a ghost. And these people, the Babylonians, were highly superstitious. So it would be even more powerful to a person who doesn't believe in God. We could just say it's a demon or an angel. What's he going to say? It's one of his gods, and he better worry and find out what it means. Okay, well, I guess we can take another break now. You have a question. Go ahead.
Just curious about the moat around the city.
Yep.
Have they actually found is there gates on?
I'm sure that the iron bars would have rusted out by now. They found the moats and the city walls. And I'm guessing that one of the early slides, I think one of the early slides of Babylon might have shown, let me go back and look at these slides. Yeah, you can see the moat on both of the maps of the empire, both 2 and 3. Slides 2 and 3 both show the water around the city. Yeah, they both show the water around the city. It's quite wide. You would have to take boats to get across. They were very impressive. Nebuchadnezzar, except when the generals inside opened the gates for you.
Typically, would moats be that large, like in medieval times when they looked around the castles?
No, because they didn't have that water. See, the Euphrates River ran through the Babylonian city itself. So they had permanent water supply, and all they had to do was build little gates to get the water to go around the city as well. So they had access to unlimited water. The castles did not. I mean, they could build it deep and hope for a lot of rain, but right, no rivers. Okay, well, let's take a 10-minute break and have some drinks and desserts or something. I'm going to have a cup of tea.